Chad Flores was 42 years old and worked as a forensic accountant out of a quiet office near Commercial Street in Portland, Maine. Most people saw a tired man in worn boots driving a faded blue Ford F-150 with rust creeping along the wheel wells. His wife, Savannah Flores, sold seven-figure waterfront homes. Their friends assumed she carried the marriage financially. Chad rarely argued, rarely explained himself. Every morning he bought the same $2.19 coffee from Harbor Bean Cafe and wrote numbers into an old leather notebook nobody ever asked about. What Savannah didn't know was that every account she had drained that morning had been built to be emptied. The sheriff handed Chad the divorce papers beside the driveway just as the moving truck doors slammed shut behind Savannah's silver Range Rover. Chad glanced once at the missing banking envelope in her hand, then quietly smiled. If you're watching tonight, comment your country and your local time below. I always like seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn revenge stories, built on patience instead of shouting, subscribe now, because this situation is about to get much worse. 3 years earlier, people in Portland used to describe Chad and Savannah Flores as balanced. That was the polite word. What they really meant was that Savannah brought energy, beauty, and ambition into every room, while Chad disappeared into the wallpaper behind her. Savannah Flores sold coastal luxury real estate across Cumberland County, oceanfront homes in Cape Elizabeth, restored colonial properties near Falmouth, glass-walled vacation estates overlooking Casco Bay. Her Instagram carried drone footage, champagne glasses, and smiling clients holding brass house keys worth more than most people's annual salaries. She knew exactly how to stand in a doorway during sunset, exactly how to laugh at the right volume, exactly how to touch a wealthy client's elbow during negotiations. At 40 years old, Savannah had built herself into a brand. Chad had built spreadsheets. Every morning, Chad woke at 5:30 without an alarm. He made black coffee in an old stainless steel machine that hissed louder each winter. He packed turkey sandwiches into wax paper. He drove downtown in his faded Ford pickup, while Savannah slept beneath white linen sheets inside their Harbor Ridge home, overlooking the Atlantic. The truck heater barely worked below 30 degrees. Chad never replaced it. People noticed things like that, especially Savannah. You know, she said one night during a dinner party, swirling wine inside a crystal glass, normal, successful people buy new vehicles before rust starts showing through the paint. The table laughed lightly, not cruelly, just enough. Grant Whitmore laughed the loudest. That was the first night Chad watched him carefully. Grant was the kind of man magazines called self-made, because nobody looked closely enough at where the money actually came from. He owned Whitmore Development Group, a fast-growing luxury development company that specialized in waterfront condo projects across New England. Tall, expensive haircut, navy suit that fit like it had been sewn directly onto him. His watch alone probably cost more than Chad's truck. Grant leaned back in his chair at the Flores dining table like he already owned part of the house. "Come on, Savannah," he said. "A guy with your listings shouldn't be driving behind that pickup every morning." Savannah smiled into her wine. Chad cut another piece of steak. He didn't react. That bothered people more than anger ever would. The Harbor Ridge house sat on a slope above the water, with gray cedar siding and wide windows facing the bay. Savannah loved hosting there because the house photographed beautifully at sunset. Soft gold light poured across the hardwood floors around 6:40 every evening during summer. Clients remembered the view. Savannah made sure of that. Most of the guests who visited assumed the house belonged emotionally to her. The furniture choices were hers. The art was hers. The social atmosphere was hers. Chad occupied the house quietly. His office sat downstairs near the garage entrance. Small room, frosted glass door, metal filing cabinets, dual monitors, old desk lamp, Nobody ever wanted to see that room, which was exactly how Chad preferred it. Savannah sometimes joked about it publicly. He's probably investigating tax fraud or aliens down there. People laughed. Chad smiled politely. The truth was less dramatic and far more dangerous. He specialized in forensic accounting for insurance litigation and corporate fraud investigations. Most of his clients never met him in person. Law firms hired him quietly after embezzlement, divorce, asset disputes, or financial misconduct cases. He spent years following numbers other people thought were invisible: patterns, timing, tiny inconsistencies, a rounded transfer amount, an invoice duplicated twice, a payroll shift 3 minutes before midnight. People lied emotionally. Money lied mathematically. That was Chad's specialty. But Savannah hated how invisible the job sounded. At charity events, when people asked Chad what he did, Savannah usually answered before he could. He works with audits. Then she redirected conversation toward herself, toward listings, toward investors, toward Grant, especially toward Grant. Over time, Grant Whitmore became permanent background noise inside their marriage. Late-night calls about development projects, lunch meetings after showings, fundraisers, marina events. One evening, Chad returned home carrying groceries and saw Grant standing too close to Savannah near the kitchen island. Their conversation stopped half a second too late. Grant smiled immediately, too smoothly. "Chad," he said, "your wife's saving my project in Bar Harbor." Savannah laughed. "She wishes." Chad placed groceries on the counter: milk, bread, ground coffee, ordinary things. He noticed 2 wine glasses already open, noted it silently. The following month, Savannah started staying overnight in Boston more frequently. Real estate conferences, client negotiations, luxury property tours, always reasons, always explanations ready before Chad even asked. He stopped asking. That scared Savannah more than suspicion would have, because silence left room for observation, and Chad observed everything. One Tuesday morning in November, rain hammered Portland hard enough to blur the harbor cranes into gray shadows. Chad stopped by the mailbox before leaving for work and noticed something unusual immediately. No bank statements. That alone wasn't strange, but the absence came after 14 years of routine. Chad walked inside, slowly removed his wet jacket, and checked the kitchen counter. Nothing there either. Savannah entered moments later wearing cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone. "You heading downtown?" she asked casually. "Yes." "You mind if I use the Range Rover this afternoon? I'm showing properties in Yarmouth." "Sure." She kissed his cheek lightly, too lightly. Then she added almost carelessly, "Oh, by the way, I switched most of the billing statements to paperless, easier to organize." Most husbands would have nodded, maybe forgotten about it by dinner. Chad looked at her for 2 seconds longer than normal. Not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to confirm instinct. Because Savannah hated organizing financial paperwork, always had, which meant somebody suggested the change. Probably Grant, probably recently. Chad drove downtown through cold rain and parked beside Long Wharf. Instead of entering his office immediately, he sat inside the truck with the engine running, watching rain slide across the windshield, thinking. Not emotionally, structurally. When people prepared to leave relationships, their behavior changed in predictable stages. Privacy first, then access, then control, then movement of assets. Chad had testified to that pattern in courtrooms 12 different times. At 8:17 a.m., he opened his laptop inside the truck, logged into one account, then another, then another. The balances remained untouched, but the mailing addresses had changed 2 days earlier. His eyes stayed still on the screen. No anger, no panic, just confirmation. Then Chad noticed something else. A test transfer, small, only $4,000. Most people would never notice it buried inside operational activity. but Chad specialized in buried things. He leaned back quietly while rain struck the roof above him. Somewhere across Portland, Savannah probably believed she had made the first invisible move. What she didn't understand was that Chad Flores had spent most of his adult life building systems specifically designed to catch invisible moves. And for the first time in months, he finally opened the encrypted folder hidden beneath his client archives. The encrypted folder was named Winter Inventory. Nothing about the title attracted attention. That was intentional. Chad Flores believed the safest hiding place in the world was inside something boring. He opened the folder slowly inside his downtown office while gray November light pushed through the windows overlooking Commercial Street. Fishing boats rocked against the harbor below. Forklifts moved crates through cold mist near the docks. Portland looked calm from a distance. Most disasters did. Inside the folder sat 12 years of categorized records, PDF archives, property disclosures, digital signatures, bank authorizations, asset separation agreements, time-stamped screenshots, everything cross-indexed by date, by institution, by legal exposure level. Most people would have called it paranoid. Chad called it organized. At 8:42 a.m., his office phone rang. He let it buzz twice before answering. Flores? Consulting. Mr. Flores? This is Camden National Bank Fraud Prevention. We noticed a recent address modification request tied to 3 linked accounts. We're simply confirming authorization. Chad leaned back quietly. His voice stayed flat. Yes, I saw the changes this morning. Would you like us to reverse them? No. A short pause. Sir, leave everything exactly as it is. The woman on the line hesitated. Well, all right, we simply wanted to verify the activity. I appreciate it. He ended the call gently and wrote down the exact timestamp in his leather notebook. 8:44 a.m. Verification initiated by institution. No reversal requested. That mattered. Details always mattered, especially later. Chad spent the next hour reviewing transfer activity. Small withdrawals continued moving between accounts in cautious amounts. 4,000, 8,000, 2,500. Testing behavior. Savannah was probing the system, carefully trying not to trigger automated reviews, which told Chad something important immediately. This was not fully her idea. Savannah spent money emotionally, publicly, impulsively. These transfers were measured, structured. Grant Whitmore's fingerprints were all over them. At 10:15, Chad closed his laptop and walked 3 blocks through the cold toward Beckett's Oyster Bar near the waterfront. Tourists disappeared this time of year. The city belonged mostly to locals once winter approached. Rebecca Sloan already sat inside a rear booth, dark navy coat, silver-framed glasses, yellow legal pad beside untouched coffee. Rebecca looked like someone who had never wasted a movement in her life. Former federal prosecutor, 48 years old. Quiet reputation across Maine legal circles for dismantling financial testimony without raising her voice. Chad trusted exactly 3 attorneys in the state. Rebecca was the only one he would trust with this. "You're early," she said. "You're late." A small smile crossed her face. That counted as warmth from Rebecca Sloan. The waitress brought coffee. Chad didn't touch it immediately. Rebecca studied him for several seconds. "You look calm." "I am calm. That usually means something expensive is happening." Chad slid a folder across the table. Rebecca opened it carefully. Inside sat transaction summaries, address changes, and authorization logs. No emotional notes, no accusations, just evidence. Rebecca scanned the first 2 pages silently. "How long have you suspected this? 6 months, and the affair 3? Rebecca nodded once, like that timeline matched expectations. Grant Whitmore. "Yes, that complicates things. Because of his developments, because men like Grant don't separate romance from leverage." Rebecca flipped another page, then another. You already isolated the primary assets, yes? She only has access to operational accounts, and she knows that number Rebecca finally looked up directly. Are the operational accounts legal, fully disclosed, fully taxed, fully documented? Any hidden assets? No. Any transfers after suspicion began? Only protective restructuring through disclosed entities. Rebecca leaned back. Good answer. Not because it sounded clever, because it sounded boring. Courts trusted boring. What's your objective here, Chad? That question mattered more than people realized. Anger destroyed strategy in divorce cases faster than betrayal ever could. Chad looked through the restaurant window toward the harbor cranes. I want documentation. That's not an objective. I want the truth recorded correctly. Rebecca watched him carefully. You still care about her? Chad didn't answer immediately, because silence sometimes admitted more than words. Finally, he said, I care about fairness. Rebecca almost smiled again. That wasn't my question. The waitress refilled coffee. Neither touched it. Outside, snow mixed lightly into the rain. Rebecca closed the folder. All right, here's what happens next. She spoke clearly, methodically. She'll escalate gradually first, more transfers, more control attempts, then she'll push emotional confrontation to provoke you into reacting badly. She already changed statement access. Good. Letter. She'll probably try removing you from the house soon. I know. Rebecca tapped one fingernail against the folder. The important thing is this: don't interrupt people while they're building evidence against themselves. Most men in Chad's position would have confronted Savannah immediately, checked phones, tracked locations, started screaming. But Chad had spent 15 years watching financial investigations collapse because emotional people moved too early. Timing mattered more than outrage. Always. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. One more thing. If grants involved financially, this may become larger than divorce court. Chad's expression didn't change, but internally certain pieces aligned harder into place, because he already suspected Grant Whitmore wasn't clean. Nobody accumulated that much waterfront property that quickly, without bending something: loans, valuations, construction, invoices, political favors, usually all four. I'll start reviewing his entities, Chad said quietly. Rebecca nodded once. Do it privately. They stood to leave. Before Chad reached the door, Rebecca stopped him. When this becomes ugly, and it will, you need to remember something. Chad waited. Winning quietly still counts as winning. Outside, freezing wind rolled off Casco Bay hard enough to sting exposed skin. Chad buttoned his coat and walked back toward his office alone. His phone buzzed halfway down the block. Savannah, he answered calmly. Hey, she said warmly, too warmly. You busy somewhat? I was thinking maybe we should spend the weekend in Boston soon. Things have felt tense lately. Chad kept walking, past lobster traps stacked beside the docks, past tourists hurrying through sleet. You've been distant, Savannah continued. I've been working. Well, maybe we should reconnect. Reconnect. Interesting word. Usually used right before someone detonated a marriage. What did you have in mind? Chad asked. Oh, I don't know. Maybe dinner at Mariner's. Like old times. Mariner's was expensive. Savannah only suggested expensive places when guilt entered the room. Chad noticed another thing too. Traffic sounds echoed around her. Not home, not office, moving vehicle, Grant probably driving. I'll check my schedule, Chad said. Okay. A pause. Then Savannah asked casually, by the way, did you happen to notice the statement changes? There it was. Testing reaction. Measuring awareness. Yes, Chad answered. And what? Another small pause. I just figured you'd ask about it. I assumed there was a reason. Savannah exhaled softly. Relief. That told Chad everything. She still believed he was passive. Still believed silence meant ignorance. You're always so easy about things, she said. Chad stopped walking for the first time. Wind pushed snow across the sidewalk around his boots. "No," he said quietly. "I'm usually just patient." He ended the call before she could answer. Then he stood there for several seconds watching ferries move slowly through gray water. Because patience and weakness looked almost identical from the outside, that confusion ruined people every day. Back inside his office, Chad locked the door and reopened his laptop. This time he typed one specific search into a private financial database. Whitmore Development Group, LLC. The results began loading slowly across the screen, and within seconds Chad noticed the first discrepancy. 2 identical invoice chains, different amounts, same contractor. The first real explosion happened on a Saturday evening in early December. Cold Atlantic wind rolled across Harbor Ridge hard enough to shake the cedar siding of the houses overlooking the water. Inside the Flores home, Savannah had organized another networking dinner. 8 guests, investors, realtors, 2 city council members, Grant Whitmore at the center of all of it. Candles burned along the dining table. Jazz drifted softly from hidden speakers. The house smelled like garlic butter and expensive wine. From upstairs, Savannah's laughter carried through the hallway before Chad even entered the kitchen. He had spent most of the afternoon downstairs reviewing Whitmore Development Group records. 3 shell LLCs connected to one contractor, inflated marina restoration invoices, duplicate billing chains routed through separate holding entities. Nothing illegal yet, but close enough to smell it. Chad removed his coat quietly near the front entrance. Savannah spotted him immediately. "There you are," she said, smiling too brightly. "I was starting to think you were avoiding us." Several guests turned toward him politely. Grant leaned casually against the marble countertop holding a bourbon glass. "Chad," he said, "we're discussing actual business upstairs tonight. You should join us." A few people laughed softly. Not openly cruel, just comfortable. That was the danger with wealthy social circles in Portland. Nobody needed to insult you directly. Exclusion arrived disguised as humor. Chad loosened his cuffs. "I already worked today." Grant grinned. "Some of us never stop." Another small wave of laughter. Savannah watched Chad carefully after that one, waiting, testing, looking for irritation, for embarrassment, for some visible crack she could later describe to friends over wine. But Chad simply walked toward the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of water. That calmness irritated Savannah more each month, because she increasingly needed Chad to behave like the weaker person she imagined him to be. Instead, he behaved like someone watching weather patterns. Dinner moved upstairs around 7:30. Chad sat near the end of the table while conversations drifted between real estate investment opportunities and luxury coastal developments. Grant dominated the room effortlessly. He described a new waterfront condo project near Portsmouth, New Hampshire. 32 units, Grant said confidently. Private marina access, rooftop glass lounge. We're expecting 40% appreciation before completion. One councilman nodded. "That's aggressive?" "That's modern coastal money," Grant replied. Savannah smiled proudly beside him. Not beside Chad, beside Grant. Chad noticed that detail without changing expression. Throughout dinner, Savannah interrupted Chad repeatedly. When he mentioned market instability, she redirected. When he answered questions too technically, she joked about him talking accountant. At one point, a guest asked Chad directly what kind of cases he handled. Before he answered, Savannah laughed lightly. "Oh, Chad investigates boring disasters so the rest of us can sleep." The table chuckled. Grant added, "Everybody needs a hobby." Chad cut another piece of salmon slowly. Then he looked up. "It's not a hobby." The table quieted slightly. Not because he raised his voice, because he didn't. Grant leaned back casually. "So what's the most exciting thing you've uncovered?" Chad took a sip of water first. Usually the people pretending nothing's wrong. Silence lasted half a second too long. Then Savannah forced another laugh. Well, that sounds cheerful. Conversation restarted. But Grant studied Chad differently after that, carefully, like a man realizing the furniture might not actually be furniture. Around 9:30, snow began falling outside. Guests gathered near the windows overlooking Casco Bay while Savannah opened another bottle of wine. Chad stood near the staircase checking messages on his phone when he overheard Savannah speaking quietly to Grant near the kitchen entrance. He barely notices anything she whispered. Grant smirked. Men like him notice spreadsheets, not life. Savannah laughed softly. Chad looked down at his phone screen without reacting, but internally something settled into place. Not heartbreak. That stage had already passed weeks earlier. This was confirmation. The marriage was no longer damaged. It was operationally over. At 10:12 p.m., the final guests left Harbor Ridge. Headlights disappeared slowly down the icy neighborhood roads, while ocean wind rattled the bare trees outside. Inside the house, Savannah began stacking wine glasses aggressively into the sink. "You embarrassed me tonight," she said suddenly. Chad removed plates from the dining table. "How you always do that thing." "What thing?" That cold silence. "Like you're judging everyone." "I wasn't." Savannah turned sharply. "Oh, please, Chad. You walk around acting smarter than everybody while driving that pathetic truck and hiding downstairs in your little office." Chad placed another plate into the sink carefully. "You invited them here. That's not the point." "No," Chad said quietly. "It usually isn't." Her jaw tightened immediately, because calm responses gave her nothing to attack directly. "You know what your problem is," Savannah snapped. "You have no ambition." Chad looked at her fully for the first time that evening. Interesting accusation, especially from someone draining his accounts in secret. "I work," he said. "You hide." The kitchen fell silent except for wind outside. Savannah stepped closer. "Look around this house. This life exists because I built relationships. I built visibility. I built value." Chad watched her carefully. Savannah genuinely believed that. That was the dangerous part. People often confuse visible success with structural ownership. "And you think I didn't contribute?" he asked. "You made spreadsheets?" There it was again. Spreadsheets. Like numbers weren't the skeleton underneath every luxury lifestyle she admired. Grant's condos existed because of financing structures. Savannah's commissions existed because of transaction records. Her designer kitchen existed because somebody somewhere balanced ledgers correctly. But Chad understood something important. People rarely respected invisible labor until invisible labor disappeared. Savannah folded her arms tightly. "I'm tired of carrying someone who refuses to evolve." Chad noticed the wording immediately. Carrying, refuses, not emotional words, prepared words, rehearsed. Probably discussed with Grant already. He dried his hands with a kitchen towel slowly. "What exactly do you want, Savannah?" That question hung heavily in the room, because now they were finally approaching the truth. Savannah looked away first, toward the dark windows, toward the ocean beyond them. "I want space." Chad nodded once. "How much? A few weeks?" "No," Chad said calmly. "How much space?" She turned back sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means people usually measure emotional distance before legal distance." For the first time all night, Savannah looked slightly uncertain. Only slightly. "You're being dramatic." "Am I? You know what? Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while." There it was. The first direct push. Chad studied her face quietly. Not angry, not pleading, just observing. Because once someone reached this stage emotionally, the paperwork usually already existed somewhere. He wondered whether divorce documents had already been drafted. Probably. He also wondered whether Grant was waiting nearby right now. Possibly. Chad walked downstairs toward his office without another word. Savannah followed halfway. Where are you going to pack? That answer startled her, because she expected resistance, arguments, maybe desperation. Instead, Chad opened his office calmly and removed 2 storage boxes from the closet, one for clothes, one for records. Savannah stood in the doorway watching. You're seriously leaving for now. That's it. What did you expect? She didn't answer, because she didn't know. Chad packed carefully. Laptop, external hard drives, leather notebook, 3 client folders, 1 framed photograph of his father from El Paso. Nothing else. Savannah crossed her arms. You're making this weirdly easy. Chad zipped the final bag. No, he said quietly. You're just surprised I saw it coming. Her expression shifted immediately. Tiny movement, but real. Then Chad walked upstairs, grabbed his coat, and headed toward the front door. As he stepped outside into the freezing night air, headlights reflected briefly across the snow-covered driveway. Black Mercedes sedan, engine running. Grant Whitmore inside, waiting. Chad paused for exactly 1 second beside the truck, long enough to see Grant glance away first. Interesting, very interesting. Then Chad climbed into the Ford F-150 and drove into the snowstorm, while Harbor Ridge disappeared slowly behind him in the mirrors. And upstairs, Savannah entered Chad's downstairs office for the first time in nearly a year. What she found inside would convince her she had already won. Savannah entered Chad's downstairs office at 11:18 that night. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Snowlight reflected weakly through the narrow basement windows. For years, she had treated the office like storage space attached to her husband. Now she finally looked at it closely. Metal filing cabinets, neatly labeled archive boxes, external hard drives stacked beside accounting textbooks, a wall calendar filled with coded markings she didn't understand. No family photos except 1 framed picture of Chad's father standing beside an old pickup truck under the Texas sun. The room felt disciplined, controlled, almost military. Savannah walked slowly toward the desk. Then she saw the folders Chad had intentionally left behind. Camden National, Northeast Trust, Marital Holdings, Account Summaries. She sat down immediately. Outside, Grant's Mercedes still idled quietly near the curb. Savannah opened the first folder. Numbers, balances, transfer histories, investment summaries. The totals made her heartbeat accelerate, much larger than she expected. She had always assumed Chad earned decent money quietly through consulting work, but seeing organized statements with 6-figure balances triggered something deeper. Validation. Proof that she had been right to prepare an exit. Proof that Chad had hidden resources while acting modest. She grabbed her phone immediately. Grant answered after 2 rings. Well, Savannah lowered her voice instinctively. You were right. About what he's sitting on way more money than he pretends. A small pause. Then Grant asked carefully how much Savannah flipped pages faster. There are multiple linked accounts, operational reserves, investment accounts, business holdings. Grant's tone sharpened immediately. Are they joint sum? You need copies. I'm already taking photos. Grant went quiet for a second, calculating. Listen carefully, he said. You need to secure access before he starts moving things. Savannah looked toward the basement door. He already left. Good. That single word echoed strangely inside the office. Good. Not sad, not complicated. Good. Grant continued speaking. If Chad's smart financially, he'll try protecting assets quickly once divorce starts. You need leverage now. Savannah stared at the folders. She suddenly realized she didn't actually know how much control Chad had over their finances. For years, she had avoided details because details bored her. Chad handled taxes, insurance, retirement accounts, entity filings, everything invisible. She handled people. That division used to feel efficient. Now it felt dangerous. What if he freezes access? Savannah asked. He won't if you move first. Grant's voice stayed smooth and confident, like a man discussing weather instead of destroying a marriage. Start transferring shared liquidity gradually, small amounts. Don't trigger compliance reviews. Savannah nodded automatically despite him not being there. She trusted confidence. Always had. That weakness had built her entire adult life. By midnight, Savannah had already begun. She logged into the first joint account from Chad's office computer, then another. Small transfers first. Testing limits. $4,000, $8,000, $12,000. Each transfer routed into separate personal accounts under her name. She smiled after the third success. Too easy. That thought stayed with her repeatedly over the following week. Too easy. Meanwhile, Chad Flores rented a small furnished apartment above a hardware store near Munjoy Hill. 1 bedroom, old radiator, heat, view of the harbor through narrow windows. The kind of temporary place most people associated with failure. Chad unpacked slowly. Laptop on kitchen table, notebook beside coffee maker, hard drives inside locked drawer. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic. At 6:12 the next morning, his phone buzzed with the first transaction alert. Transfer complete, $8,000. He read the notification while drinking coffee barefoot in silence. Then he wrote down the timestamp. No anger, no reaction, just another entry. Across the next 11 days, Savannah escalated. She drained the joint checking account first, then emergency reserves, then operational accounts linked to holding entities she barely understood. Each time, Chad received alerts instantly. Each time, he documented them carefully. Rebecca Sloan met him twice during that period. The second meeting happened inside her office near Federal Street while freezing rain hammered the windows outside. Rebecca reviewed the newest transaction list without visible emotion. She's accelerating, she said. Yes. She thinks you're unaware. Yes. Rebecca placed the papers down. You understand most spouses would seek emergency injunctions already. I know. And you still want to wait? Chad looked toward the rain outside. She hasn't crossed the line yet. Rebecca folded her arms. You're being generous. No. I'm being thorough. That answer mattered, because Chad understood something many people didn't. In financial cases, patterns mattered more than incidents. One irrational transfer could be explained emotionally. Repeated coordinated behavior became evidence. Rebecca tapped the latest report. The compliance thresholds will eventually trigger. I know. You designed them that way, yes. Another pause. You planned for this years ago, Chad answered honestly. I planned for vulnerability. Rebecca studied him carefully after that. Most people misunderstood men like Chad Flores. They assumed quiet men lacked confidence because they lacked performance. But Chad's calmness came from structure. Preparation reduced panic. Documentation reduced fear. Systems reduced chaos. When you spent years investigating fraud, you eventually learned a brutal truth about human beings. People usually revealed themselves the moment they believed consequences no longer applied. Savannah was revealing herself now, completely. That Friday evening, she celebrated openly. Grant reserved a private table at the Clam House Grill overlooking Portland Harbor. Snow covered the sidewalks outside, while expensive whiskey glowed amber beneath dim restaurant lighting. Savannah wore black silk, diamond earrings, confidence. Grant raised a glass toward her. To freedom. Savannah laughed softly. To finally being done pretending. Grant smirked. And Chad. She waved dismissively. He's still acting weirdly calm. Grant cut into his steak. That's because he's passive. Savannah wanted to believe that, desperately, because the alternative felt unsettling. She remembered the way Chad looked at Grant beside the truck that night. Not angry, not intimidated, measured, like a man solving something privately. Grant noticed her hesitation. What? Nothing. You feel guilty? Savannah scoffed immediately. No. Then what? She looked out the restaurant window toward the harbor lights. It's just, he hasn't fought at all. Grant leaned back confidently. That's because there's nothing he can do. Again, Savannah wanted to believe him. But deep down, small inconsistencies kept bothering her. Chad hadn't begged, hadn't threatened, hadn't even argued properly. Most men reacted emotionally once money disappeared, especially once homes became threatened. But Chad kept responding with silence, and silence created uncertainty. Back in the apartment near Munjoy Hill, Chad sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing account activity beneath a dim overhead light. 3 monitors glowed softly across the room. Transaction chains, routing numbers, timestamp logs. He noticed something important immediately. Savannah had started consolidating transfers through one particular personal account. That was careless, very careless. Worse, one transfer connected briefly to a Whitmore development operational entity before rerouting outward. Again, tiny mistake, probably accidental, but enough. Chad opened another secure folder, this one labeled Whitmore. Then he cross-referenced the routing activity against contractor invoices he had reviewed earlier. Same secondary entity, same regional processing bank. His eyes narrowed slightly for the first time all evening. Interesting. Very interesting. At 9:47 p.m., Chad's phone rang. Rebecca. You were right, she said immediately. About what federal compliance just flagged one of the transfers. Snow drifted past Chad's apartment window silently. How serious? Not serious yet, Rebecca said. But now there's a review trail. Exactly what Chad expected. Exactly when he expected it. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. Chad, if Whitmore's involved financially, this thing may expand fast. Chad looked at the frozen harbor beyond the glass, then at the transaction chain glowing across his screen. Savannah thought she was stealing freedom. Grant thought he was exploiting a weak husband. Neither understood the real danger yet, because the accounts they were draining had never been built to protect money. They had been built to expose behavior. And now, the system was finally beginning to react. Chad Flores learned to document things before he learned to trust people. That lesson started in El Paso, Texas during the summer he turned 14. His father, Miguel Flores, owned a small auto repair shop near Alameda Avenue. Nothing fancy. 3 service bays, rusted signage, coffee stains on every invoice counter. Miguel worked 6 days a week rebuilding transmissions beneath desert heat that reached 108 degrees in July. He trusted everybody, especially family. That trust destroyed him. One cousin handled the bookkeeping for 2 years, quietly siphoned inventory payments, falsified supplier invoices, and borrowed against business credit lines Miguel barely understood. By the time the fraud surfaced, the shop collapsed under debt. Chad still remembered the silence at their dinner table afterward. Not shouting, not violence, just silence. His father staring at unpaid bills under weak kitchen light, while his mother sold jewelry piece by piece to keep electricity running. That silence changed Chad permanently. People lied. Paper remembered. At 16, Chad began organizing household bills alphabetically in old cardboard boxes. By college, he scanned every important document twice. By 30, he maintained encrypted archives so thorough that some law firms quietly called him the human ledger. Most people who met Chad never imagined any of that. They saw worn boots, cheap coffee, quiet posture. They missed the architecture underneath. That Saturday morning in Portland, Chad woke before sunrise inside the small Munjoy Hill apartment and began his routine exactly at 5:30 a.m. Coffee, cold shower, transaction review, backup encryption. Outside snow drifted across the harbor in soft gray sheets while tugboats moved slowly through frozen water. His laptop screen glowed blue in the dark kitchen. 3 new transfers overnight. Savannah was becoming bolder now. $22,000 routed through 2 linked personal accounts. Another 15 moved toward a temporary holding entity connected indirectly to Whitmore Development. Chad tracked each movement carefully. Timestamp, routing institution, authorization method, device location. Then he exported everything into a secure evidence archive Rebecca Sloan already mirrored remotely. At 7:14 a.m., Rebecca called. "You're up already." "I'm always up already." She ignored the joke. "I reviewed the newest transfer chain, and she's getting sloppy." Chad sipped coffee quietly. "No," he said. "She's getting comfortable." That distinction mattered. Fear created caution. Confidence created exposure. Rebecca exhaled softly over the phone. The compliance review expanded overnight. How far one additional institution? Chad nodded slightly. Expected. Not ideal, but expected. What about Whitmore? Rebecca paused. That's where things get interesting. Chad waited. Grant Whitmore's development company is already carrying unusual debt exposure tied to the Portsmouth Marina project. How unusual enough that federal review won't help him? Chad leaned back in his chair slowly. That explained the pressure. Grant wasn't chasing Savannah emotionally. He was chasing liquidity, temporary money, bridge money, easy money. And Savannah, hungry for validation, status, and movement, had become useful. Rebecca spoke again. "You still haven't told me one thing." When exactly did you begin preparing these shell structures?" Chad looked toward the snow-covered harbor outside. "About 4 years ago." "That long?" "Yes." Rebecca stayed silent for a moment. Because 4 years changed the emotional shape of everything. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. "What triggered it?" she asked carefully. Chad thought about the answer before giving it. Not because he was hiding truth, because he disliked dramatics. "Patterns changed," he said. "What kind of patterns?" "Spending, secrecy, language." Rebecca waited. Chad continued quietly. "Savannah stopped talking about stability, started talking about visibility." That sentence explained more than most marriage counselors could explain in 6 months. Visibility. Savannah loved appearances because appearances gave her emotional oxygen. Luxury dinners, recognition, public admiration, photographs beside wealthy clients. Grant Whitmore represented expansion of that world. Chad represented structure beneath it. Invisible structure eventually becomes unappreciated until it disappears. After ending the call, Chad opened another archive file labeled Personal Contingency. Inside sat years of legally documented restructuring, trust formations, premarital inheritance protections, corporate separations, everything disclosed properly through attorneys and tax filings. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden from courts. That distinction mattered enormously. People confused asset protection with fraud all the time. Chad never crossed that line. He simply built walls early because he understood human beings too well not to. Around noon, Chad drove toward South Portland for groceries. His old Ford heater rattled weakly against the freezing air while sports radio murmured quietly through worn speakers. At a red light near the Casco Bay Bridge, he spotted Savannah's silver Range Rover turning toward the waterfront district. Grant sat in the passenger seat, laughing. Savannah looked happier than she had in months. For a brief moment, something painful moved quietly through Chad's chest. Not jealousy. Loss. Loss behaved differently. Jealousy wanted possession back. Loss simply acknowledged something had already ended. The light changed. Chad drove forward without following them. That restraint mattered too, Because once people started chasing betrayal physically, they usually stopped thinking strategically. And Chad needed strategy more than emotion now. Later that afternoon, Savannah entered Harbor Ridge carrying shopping bags from Portland boutiques while Grant followed behind holding garment boxes. The house felt different lately, larger, colder, more temporary. She tried not to notice that. Grant poured bourbon near the fireplace while Savannah unpacked designer clothing across the bedroom. "You should sell the truck after divorce," Grant said casually. Savannah laughed. "Oh my God, yes. Seriously, that thing looks like a landscaping vehicle." She smiled while hanging dresses inside the closet. "He refuses to spend money on himself." Grant took a drink. Men who act broke usually are broke. Savannah paused slightly, because now she knew Chad wasn't broke, or at least she believed she knew. "You'd be surprised," she said. Grant looked over. "What's that supposed to mean?" Savannah lowered her voice instinctively. "He has more money than he pretends." Grant's expression sharpened immediately. "How much more?" "A lot." "Liquid sum." Grant stared into the fireplace quietly after that. Calculating again, always calculating. Savannah noticed it this time, not fully, but enough to feel a small, uncomfortable shift beneath her ribs. Then Grant smiled again, smooth, confident, dangerous. "Well," he said softly, "that just means you were smart to move first." Meanwhile, 2 miles away, Chad sat inside Rebecca Sloan's office reviewing printed disclosures. Rebecca circled several sections with a black pen. These matter most: signed acknowledgement forms, shared account disclosures, asset classifications. Savannah's signatures appeared repeatedly over the years: vacation signatures, holiday signatures, quick signatures before dinner reservations. She barely read any of them. Rebecca looked up. "She'll claim ignorance eventually." "I know. And technically she may even believe it." Chad nodded quietly. Because that was the tragedy underneath everything. Savannah didn't think she ignored Chad maliciously. She simply stopped valuing anything that lacked spectacle. Rebecca closed the file. "One more issue. What if Whitmore's financial review deepens? Savannah may become collateral exposure." Chad's eyes stayed still. "That depends how involved she becomes." Rebecca studied him carefully. "You still want to protect her?" "No," Chad said quietly. "I want consequences to stay proportional." That answer lingered in the room. Because proportionality required discipline. Most betrayed spouses eventually wanted destruction. Chad wanted accuracy, and accuracy was colder. That evening, Chad returned to the apartment just after dark. He removed his boots near the radiator and checked his phone. 3 missed notifications, another transfer attempt. Then a 4th notification appeared. Failed transaction, insufficient access authorization. Chad frowned slightly. Interesting. Savannah had finally reached one of the deeper structural barriers. He opened the transaction logs carefully. The blocked account wasn't operational. It connected indirectly to one of Chad's protected inheritance trusts, originally funded after his father's death. Savannah must have found references inside the Harbor Ridge office files, which meant she was searching aggressively now, searching without understanding. Dangerous combination. At 9:22 p.m., another message arrived from Rebecca. Simple, urgent. "Call me." Chad dialed immediately. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "We may have a problem." Chad stood motionless beside the kitchen window. "What happened?" "Grant Whitmore just received notice of preliminary federal financial review." Snow drifted silently across Portland outside, and Savannah Chad asked. Rebecca's voice lowered carefully. "She may already be attached to the paper trail." Grant Whitmore built his reputation the same way casinos were built in Atlantic City. Fast, bright, and mostly with borrowed confidence. By the time he turned 46, Grant had become a recognizable name across coastal New England development circles. Magazine interviews, Chamber of Commerce awards, Photographs beside governors and investors holding silver ceremonial shovels in front of half-finished luxury projects. He understood optics better than numbers. That was dangerous, especially in real estate. Grant's Portsmouth Marina project sat at the center of his growing empire. Luxury condominiums overlooking the harbor, private slips for yachts, rooftop cocktail lounge, fitness spa, glass balconies facing the Atlantic. The promotional renderings looked beautiful. The financing underneath looked unstable. Chad Flores saw that immediately. 3 days after Rebecca's warning, Chad sat alone inside his downtown office reviewing Whitmore Development Group records across dual monitors while freezing rain streaked the windows outside. Invoice chains, contractor filings, loan structures, everything arranged chronologically. The deeper Chad looked, the less organic the numbers became. Contractor A invoiced $480,000 for seawall repairs. Contractor B invoiced another $310,000, referencing the same repair zone. Both companies shared one mailing address. Different LLCs, same accountant. Classic layering behavior. Not enough for criminal charges by itself, but enough to attract scrutiny once regulators started looking. And now regulators were looking. At 11:06 a.m., Chad received another compliance notification through one of the monitored accounts. Large transfer pending approval. Destination Whitmore Development Holdings. Amount $94,000. Chad stared at the screen for several seconds. Savannah. She finally crossed from personal spending into business movement. That changed everything. He immediately exported the transfer trail and forwarded it to Rebecca Sloan through encrypted channels. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair. Outside, harbor fog swallowed most of Portland's waterfront. Inside, Chad felt something colder than anger, disappointment. Not because Savannah left him, because she trusted Grant more than evidence. That afternoon, Savannah met Grant at his office near 4th Street. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor while architects and assistants moved briskly through modern glass hallways carrying project folders. Grant liked offices that looked expensive. It reassured investors. Savannah entered carrying coffee from a cafe downstairs. Grant barely looked up from his phone. That transfer cleared, he asked immediately. Savannah hesitated slightly. "Good afternoon to you, too." Grant smiled automatically and kissed her cheek. "There. Better." She sat across from him. "I moved 94. Grant nodded approvingly. "Perfect." Savannah studied him carefully. For the first time in weeks, she noticed how often Grant discussed money before discussing anything else. "How much pressure are you under exactly?" she asked. Grant leaned back casually. "Temporary pressure." "That's not an answer. It's development financing, Savannah. Timing matters." She looked toward the harbor outside. Federal review matters, too. That got his attention. Grant's expression sharpened slightly. "Who told you that? Nobody." "I'm not stupid." He stood and walked toward the window. "You're overthinking." "No," Savannah said quietly. "Chad's overthinking. And that's making me nervous." Grant turned around slowly. "Chad is an accountant. He's a forensic accountant. Same thing." "No," Savannah replied. "Not the same thing." Silence settled briefly across the office. Grant walked back toward the desk, calmly. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Men like Chad survive by making people believe they're smarter than everyone else." Savannah folded her arms. And eventually somebody challenges them. His voice carried that polished confidence Savannah always found attractive. But today, something underneath it felt thinner, less stable. Grant opened a drawer and removed several documents. "We need additional short-term liquidity movement before the next phase of financing closes?" Savannah frowned. "What kind of movement? Temporary bridge transfers?" "I already moved money, and we may need more." That sentence landed heavily. because now the scale felt different, less romantic, more operational. Grant slid paperwork across the desk, just signatures authorizing temporary investment participation. Savannah scanned the pages quickly, too quickly. LLCs, participation structures, short-term funding allocations. Most of it sounded sophisticated enough to discourage questions. Grant watched her carefully. You trust me, right? That question always appeared before dangerous paperwork. Savannah signed anyway. Across town, Chad sat inside Rebecca Sloane's office reviewing copies of those same entity names. Rebecca circled 2 with a black pen. These companies keep appearing repeatedly, shell-layering Chad said. You're sure? Not fully. But the invoice duplication is deliberate. Rebecca tapped the newest transfer alert, and now Savannah's tied directly to one of them. Chad remained silent. Rebecca studied him closely. You still haven't shown emotion once through this entire process. Chad looked down at the paperwork. That's not true. What are you feeling? He thought about it honestly. Like I'm watching someone walk onto thin ice after warning them not to. Rebecca leaned back slowly. That's probably the saddest description of divorce I've ever heard. At 6:40 p.m., Chad drove toward Cape Elizabeth for a client meeting. Snow covered the roadside pines while Atlantic wind pushed white spray against the rocks below the lighthouse cliffs. His phone buzzed at a red light. Savannah. He considered letting it ring out, then answered. Hey, she said softly. Different tone tonight. Less sharp, more uncertain. What's wrong? Chad asked immediately. That surprised her. How did you know something's wrong? Because you called. Silence. Then Savannah sighed. I just wanted to ask, are you talking to lawyers? Direct question, important timing. Yes. Another pause. You moved fast. No, Chad said calmly. I moved early. Traffic lights reflected across melting snow outside the windshield. Savannah lowered her voice. Do you hate me? Interesting question. Because people usually ask that when guilt finally began outrunning the excitement. Chad answered honestly. No. Then why do you sound so distant? Because distance already happened. Savannah closed her eyes briefly on the other end of the line. For a moment she almost sounded emotional again, almost human beneath all the ambition and performance. Then she asked the real question, are we in financial trouble? There it was. Not heartbreak, not marriage, risk. Chad looked through the windshield at dark Atlantic water beyond the road. That depends who you're financially connected to. Silence. Longer this time. What does that mean? It means you should start reading documents before signing them. Her breathing changed slightly. Small detail, but noticeable. Chad? He interrupted gently. Did Grant ask you for money? Savannah said nothing, which answered enough. Chad closed his eyes briefly. Not out of anger, out of inevitability, because now the structure was fully visible. Grant needed liquidity. Savannah needed status and emotional escape. Together they created exactly the kind of reckless behavior Chad had testified about in courtrooms for years. The only difference now was personal proximity. Finally, Savannah spoke quietly. You always act like you understand everything. No, Chad said. I just pay attention when patterns repeat. He ended the call before she could respond. Later that night, Grant Whitmore hosted investors at a private marina club outside Portland Harbor. Expensive whiskey, floor-to-ceiling windows, quiet jazz. He looked relaxed externally. Internally, pressure was building fast. 2 lenders had started requesting clarification documents. A regional compliance review froze one processing chain temporarily, and now Savannah sounded nervous. Nervous people became liabilities. Grant hated liabilities. One investor approached him near the bar. Heard there's some chatter around Portsmouth financing. Grant smiled immediately. People confuse growth with risk. The investor laughed. But Grant's smile disappeared the second the man walked away. because growth and risk were becoming the same thing now. At 11:13 p.m., Chad sat alone inside the Munjoy Hill apartment, reviewing one final transfer log before sleeping. Then another encrypted message arrived from Rebecca. 3 words, subpoenas in motion. Chad stared at the message while wind rattled the apartment windows. The system had started moving, quietly, officially. And somewhere across Portland, Savannah Flores still believed she was escaping a boring husband. She still didn't understand she had attached herself to a collapsing financial structure at the exact moment federal attention began turning toward it. The mediation room inside Casco Bay Family Law Center looked intentionally harmless. Soft beige walls, fake plants, muted landscape paintings of Maine lighthouses. The kind of room designed to convince angry people to behave reasonably. At 9:03 a.m., Chad Flores entered carrying a worn leather folder beneath one arm. Dark charcoal coat, plain blue tie, no wedding ring. He nodded politely to the receptionist and sat near the far end of the waiting area without touching his phone. Across the room, another couple argued quietly over child custody paperwork. A coffee machine buzzed near the hallway. Ordinary sounds, ordinary disasters. At 9:11, Savannah arrived. Everything about her entrance felt deliberate. Cream-colored designer coat, perfect makeup, gold earrings Chad had bought during their 10th anniversary trip to Charleston. She walked beside attorney Martin Keller, a high-profile divorce lawyer from Portland, known for aggressive asset extraction during high-income separations. Martin carried a leather briefcase thick enough to signal intention before speaking. Savannah spotted Chad immediately. For half a second, her expression shifted unexpectedly. Not guilt, discomfort, because Chad looked calmer than he should have. Then the expression vanished. Martin approached first. "Mr. Flores." Chad stood politely and shook his hand once. Firm? Neutral? Martin smiled professionally. "My client hopes today can remain productive." Rebecca Sloan appeared beside Chad almost silently. Dark navy suit, reading glasses in hand. "I'm sure it will," she said. Martin recognized her immediately. That mattered. People in Maine legal circles knew Rebecca Sloan's reputation. She dismantled emotional cases using paperwork. And paperwork frightened lawyers more than shouting did. The mediator escorted everyone into conference room B at 9:26. Long oak table. Pitcher of water, legal pads, cold fluorescent lighting overhead. Savannah sat beside Martin, Chad beside Rebecca. Distance measured carefully down the center of the table. The mediator began with standard language about cooperation and equitable division. Nobody listened closely, because everyone already understood the real purpose of the room: positioning. Savannah crossed her legs calmly, confident, prepared. Martin opened first. "My client seeks primary possession of the Harbor Ridge residence continuation of existing lifestyle support division, of all marital liquid assets, retirement allocations, and temporary spousal support during transition." He spoke smoothly, practiced. Savannah kept her eyes forward the entire time. Martin continued. "Additionally, due to Mr. Flores voluntarily vacating the marital residence, we believe residential continuity strongly favors Mrs. Flores." Chad said nothing. Rebecca made one small note on her yellow legal pad. Martin interpreted silence as weakness. Most people did initially. "We also have concerns," Martin added, "regarding possible concealed financial structures connected to Mr. Flores's consulting business." Savannah glanced sideways toward Chad briefly after that line, testing reaction. Nothing changed in his expression. Rebecca finally spoke. "Could you clarify?" Concealed Martin folded his hands. "Complex holding entities, undisclosed liquidity structures, potential marital asset shielding." Rebecca nodded once. Understood. That answer unsettled Martin slightly, because he expected defensiveness, not agreement. Savannah leaned forward confidently. There's significantly more money than Chad pretends exists. Chad looked at her quietly. Not angry, just listening. Savannah continued, encouraged by the silence. For years, he acted like we needed to budget constantly while secretly controlling multiple accounts and entities. Rebecca slid a document slowly from her folder. Mrs. Flores? She asked calmly, which specific entities are you referring to? Savannah hesitated for the first time. Several. Savannah glanced briefly toward Martin. Operational accounts, business reserves. Rebecca waited. Silence expanded carefully across the room. Finally, Savannah said Northeast Trust Holdings, Camden Reserve accounts, multiple linked portfolios. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked the question that changed the temperature inside the room. Can you identify which of those accounts you believed contained unrestricted marital reserves? Savannah blinked once. Martin answered quickly instead. Our understanding is that marital commingling occurred extensively. Rebecca turned toward him. Your understanding or your evidence? Another pause. Subtle, but important. The mediator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Martin straightened slightly. We believe discovery will establish full access patterns. Rebecca slid another packet across the table. Actually, discovery already established most of them. Martin opened the packet. His expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Good lawyers rarely reacted dramatically. But Chad noticed the small tightening around his mouth. Disclosure acknowledgments, signed financial classifications, annual entity notices, tax attachments. Savannah's signatures appeared repeatedly across nearly 8 years. Rebecca spoke softly. These documents confirm Mrs. Flores received annual disclosure summaries regarding entity classifications, operational structures, and protected holdings. Savannah frowned. I never hid money, Chad said quietly for the first time. Everyone looked toward him. His voice remained calm. I documented everything. Savannah leaned forward sharply. You buried everything in legal language. No, Chad replied. You chose not to read it. That landed harder than shouting would have, because it was true. Savannah suddenly remembered dozens of moments she had ignored paperwork impatiently. Airport lounges, vacation hotels, dinner reservations waiting downstairs. Just tell me where to sign, Chad. At the time, it felt efficient. Now it felt reckless. Martin recovered quickly. Even if classifications exist, marital lifestyle and commingling still matter. Rebecca nodded. Of course, which is why we should discuss the transfers. Savannah's posture changed slightly. Small shift, but visible. Rebecca opened another folder, transaction summaries, timestamp logs, transfer chains. Every withdrawal Savannah made sat organized chronologically across the pages. Martin scanned them carefully. His eyes slowed near the end, then slower, because now the pattern became visible. Not emotional withdrawals, structured withdrawals, repeated movement through layered accounts. Rebecca folded her hands calmly. Mrs. Flores, when you initiated these transfers, what was your understanding of the account structures? Savannah looked toward Martin again. Dangerous instinct. People look toward lawyers when they suddenly realized context mattered. I believe they were marital assets, all of them. Yes, Rebecca nodded, and the transfer into Whitmore Development Holdings. The room went still. Savannah blinked. Martin looked up sharply. What transfer? Rebecca slid one final page across the table. $94,000. Routing chain attached. Whitmore entity connection clearly visible. Savannah's breathing changed almost imperceptibly. It was temporary, she said quickly. Martin turned toward her immediately. You transferred marital funds into Whitmore Development. Grant had told her it wasn't a problem. Grant said it was bridge participation. Grant said it was temporary. Rebecca spoke carefully now. Mrs. Flores, were you aware Whitmore Development is currently under preliminary financial review? Savannah stared at her. No. Martin closed the folder slowly, very slowly, because now the case smelled different. Not just divorce, exposure, liability, potential financial misconduct. The mediator cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps for the first time that morning, he realized this mediation might fail completely. Martin leaned toward Savannah and lowered his voice. What exactly did Whitmore ask you to sign? Savannah's confidence began cracking visibly now. Not emotionally, structurally, the way ice changes color before breaking. Across the table, Chad watched quietly. No satisfaction, no triumph. Only the heavy feeling of inevitability becoming real. Rebecca turned one more page. There's another issue. Martin looked irritated now. What issue? The Harbor Ridge residence? Savannah straightened immediately. Yes, the house. Rebecca slid forward. Inheritance trust documentation. Original formation dates, property classifications, protected ownership structures. Savannah frowned harder with every page. That's impossible, she whispered. No, Rebecca said calmly. It's documented. Martin reviewed the trust paperwork carefully, then leaned back slowly. Because now he understood something important. The house was never as vulnerable as Savannah believed. Neither were most of the visible assets. Chad sat motionless while silence settled heavily across the room. Outside the conference windows, snow drifted through downtown Portland quietly. Inside, Savannah finally looked at Chad directly again, really looked at him. Not as background furniture, not as the quiet husband, as someone she suddenly realized she never fully understood. And for the first time since this began, uncertainty entered her face openly. Rebecca closed the final folder gently. We're still early in this process, she said. But I strongly recommend no additional financial movement occurs from this point forward. Savannah swallowed carefully, because somewhere beneath the panic beginning to rise inside her, one terrifying realization had finally started forming. The money she drained may not have made her rich. It may have made her traceable. Savannah Flores spent the next 48 hours trying to convince herself the mediation room had been a misunderstanding. That was easier during daylight, harder at night, especially inside Harbor Ridge. The house no longer felt victorious. It felt watched. Every hallway carried memories she suddenly viewed differently. Chad sitting quietly at the dining table reviewing tax documents while she scrolled luxury properties online. Chad asking her to read disclosure packets she signed blindly between vacations and open houses. Details she ignored were beginning to return with sharp edges. At 7:20 Monday morning, Savannah stood alone in the kitchen, wearing a cream cashmere sweater while rain hammered the windows facing Casco Bay. Her coffee had gone cold. 3 emails from Martin Keller sat unanswered on her phone. Urgent need, complete document list. Call me before speaking to Whitmore. Do not move additional funds. She hated the tone. People only use capital letters when situations stopped being elegant. The front door opened suddenly. Grant entered carrying pastries and coffee from Standard Baking Company like nothing had changed. Morning, he said smoothly. Savannah looked at him for 2 seconds too long. Grant noticed immediately. What she folded her arms. You didn't tell me about the financial review. Grant placed the coffee on the counter calmly. Because it's preliminary. You also didn't tell me those transfers could become part of discovery. They're temporary liquidity movements. That's not what Martin said. Grant exhaled slowly through his nose, already irritated. Martin Keller is a divorce lawyer. Divorce lawyers panic professionally. Savannah stepped closer, and Chad Grant smirked faintly. What about him? He knew everything. Grant looked away first. Tiny movement. But Savannah noticed it. He didn't know everything? Grant replied carefully. He prepared paperwork. That's what accountants do. No, Savannah said quietly. That's not what this is. Rain struck the windows harder. Grant removed his coat slowly. You're overreacting because he embarrassed you in mediation. Savannah almost answered immediately, then stopped, because embarrassment wasn't actually the feeling bothering her. It was disorientation. For years, she believed Chad lacked ambition because he lacked performance. He didn't compete socially, didn't advertise success, didn't dominate rooms. Now she realized Chad may have been the only person in her life who never exaggerated anything. That realization felt deeply uncomfortable. Grant interrupted her thoughts. Look, he said softer now. We just need to stabilize things for a few weeks. He smiled slightly. You and me. That phrase should have sounded comforting. Instead, it sounded contractual. Meanwhile, across Portland, Chad Flores sat inside Rebecca Sloan's office, reviewing additional disclosures, while gray rain blurred the skyline outside. Rebecca placed another stack of documents onto the table. Your wife's attorney requested preliminary settlement discussions. Chad nodded once. Expected. He sounds nervous. Also expected. Rebecca studied him quietly. You know, most people would enjoy this part. What part? The reversal. Chad looked down at the paperwork. I don't. Rebecca believed him. That was the strange thing about Chad Flores. He never seemed emotionally energized by other people's collapse, only saddened by predictability. Rebecca opened another file. We need to discuss the signatures. Chad already knew which ones. Savannah's annual acknowledgement forms, entity disclosures, trust classifications. Rebecca tapped the top page. These are devastating. They're truthful. That's usually more devastating. Chad remained silent. Rebecca leaned back slightly. She really never read them. No, not once. She skimmed headings. Rebecca shook her head slowly. People spend years demanding control over things they never bothered understanding. That sentence stayed with Chad long after the meeting ended, because it applied to far more than money. Later that afternoon, Savannah met Martin Keller inside his downtown Portland office overlooking Congress Street. Martin looked less polished than usual. Tie loosened, reading glasses low on his nose, multiple legal folders spread across his desk. He didn't offer coffee. Bad sign. Savannah sat carefully. How serious is this? Martin removed his glasses slowly. That depends how honest you're being with me. I've been honest? No, Martin said calmly. You've been selective. Savannah stiffened. I need complete clarity now. He slid transfer documents across the desk. These movements into Whitmore-connected entities create exposure. They were investments, documented where Savannah hesitated. Grant handled most of the explanations verbally. Martin noticed immediately. Oh, God, it's not illegal. I didn't say illegal. He folded his hands. I said exposed. Savannah suddenly felt cold despite the heated office. Martin continued carefully. Your husband's attorney is building a pattern argument. What does that mean? It means Chad Flores documented everything before reacting to anything. That sentence landed harder than she expected, because now she finally understood why Chad stayed calm. He wasn't passive, he was waiting. Martin opened another folder. The Harbor Ridge house situation is also worse than anticipated. Savannah frowned immediately. It's our marital home. Yes, but ownership structure matters. He lived there too, which doesn't override protected inheritance positioning if properly maintained. Savannah rubbed her forehead. This is insane. No, Martin said quietly. This is organized. He slid another document forward. Original trust formation, asset protection dates, maintenance filings. Everything clean, everything timely, everything boring. Courts loved boring. Savannah stared at Chad's signature near the bottom of one page, then her own signature beneath it. dated 6 years earlier. She remembered signing it at an airport lounge before a Cabo vacation. Didn't read a word. Martin interrupted softly. Savannah, your husband is extremely disciplined. That irritated her immediately. You sound impressed. I'm realistic. Rainwater crawled down the office windows behind him. Martin lowered his voice. You underestimated him. The truth of that sentence angered her more than the affair itself, because Savannah prided herself on reading people correctly, and she completely misread the man she lived beside for 14 years. That evening, Chad stopped at a small diner near India Street after work. Nothing expensive. Chrome stools, black coffee, lobster chowder. The waitress recognized him by now. Same order? Yes. He sat near the window while snow mixed lightly into rain outside. Around him, ordinary life continued. Dock workers eating late dinners, tourists asking directions, couples discussing Christmas plans. Meanwhile, his marriage collapsed quietly beneath legal paperwork and financial tracing systems. Chad found the contrast strangely calming. Most disasters felt enormous only to the people standing inside them. His phone buzzed once. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Flores. Yes. This is Denise Carver from Northeast Financial Compliance. We'd like to schedule a formal clarification interview regarding several linked account transfers. Chad set his spoon down carefully. Of course. We're also requesting supporting documentation regarding entity classifications. You'll have everything tonight. Another short pause. Mr. Flores, thank you for being cooperative. Cooperative. Interesting word again. People always sounded surprised when calm men cooperated with investigations, as though emotional chaos were the default expectation. After the call ended, Chad stared quietly through the diner window at wet snow falling across Portland streets. Then his phone buzzed again, this time Savannah. He considered ignoring it. Answered anyway. Hi, she said softly. Different voice again. No sharpness, no superiority, only fatigue. What happened? Chad asked. You knew about the house. Yes, and you never told me. I did tell you. Silence. Then Savannah whispered almost to herself, I never listened. That sentence lingered between them, painfully honest. Chad closed his eyes briefly, because despite everything, hearing her finally admit that hurt more than the betrayal itself. Savannah spoke again. Grant says this will settle down. Chad looked out toward the harbor lights. What do you think? Long silence. Finally, I don't know anymore. For the first time since this began, Chad heard fear underneath her voice. Real fear. Not about marriage, about instability, about consequences, about discovering too late that confidence borrowed from the wrong people eventually collapses. Before ending the call, Savannah asked one final question. Were the accounts ever real? Chad answered carefully. Yes. She frowned audibly. But not the way you thought. And somewhere across Portland, sitting alone inside Harbor Ridge while rain struck the ocean-facing windows, Savannah Flores finally began understanding the difference between visible wealth and protected wealth. One could be displayed, the other survived. The federal compliance interview took place on a Wednesday morning inside a quiet office building near Monument Square. No courtroom, no dramatic lighting, just gray carpeting, fluorescent lights, and a conference table polished enough to reflect coffee cups. That was how serious problems usually started in America. Quietly. At 8:58 a.m., Chad Flores entered, carrying 2 organized document cases and 1 encrypted hard drive. Rebecca Sloan walked beside him. Neither spoke much in the elevator because preparation had already happened. On the 7th floor, Denise Carver from Northeast Financial Compliance greeted them with professional calm. Mid-50s, short silver hair, sharp eyes that moved like scanners. 2 additional investigators sat inside the conference room reviewing files. No one smiled unnecessarily. That mattered, People who dealt with financial misconduct every day learned to distrust charm. Mr. Flores, Denise said, shaking his hand once, "Thank you for coming in voluntarily." Of course. "We understand this involves pending divorce proceedings." Yes. "And possible connected financial movement involving Whitmore Development Holdings." Yes. Chad answered every question directly. No speeches, no emotional framing. That immediately separated him from most people investigators interviewed. Denise gestured toward the table. "Please walk us through the account structures first." Chad opened the first document case. Inside sat perfectly organized binders divided by colored tabs: operational entities, protected inheritance trusts, consulting income streams, shared marital accounts, disclosure acknowledgments. Every section time-stamped, every modification documented. One investigator flipped through several pages quietly before looking up. "You maintain these records personally?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Approximately 12 years. The investigator exchanged a glance with Denise, impressed. "Not emotionally, professionally." Chad connected the encrypted drive to a secured laptop. This folder contains the full transfer chronology, including notification logs, account authorizations, and linked routing structures. Denise studied the screen carefully. "And you noticed the transfers immediately?" "Yes." "You didn't stop them?" "No." Why, Chad answered without hesitation. "Because premature intervention destroys pattern visibility." Silence settled briefly across the room. One investigator actually leaned back slightly after hearing that, because only someone deeply experienced with financial tracing would think that way naturally. Denise folded her hands. "You believed additional transfers would clarify intent?" "Yes." "And did they?" "Yes." He opened another timeline. This one showed the movement into Whitmore-linked entities. The room became noticeably quieter. Denise adjusted her glasses. "These transfers originated from operational holding accounts?" "Yes." "Were those accounts disclosed during marriage?" "Yes." "Any hidden assets?" "No." "Any unlawful shielding?" Number Rebecca Sloan finally spoke. "All protective structures were established legally through disclosed entity management and inheritance preservation." Denise nodded slowly. She had already reviewed enough documentation to know that was probably true. Meanwhile, across Portland, Grant, Whitmore sat inside his office screaming at a lender over speakerphone. "This delay is unacceptable." The lender's voice remained cold. "Federal review changed our exposure assessment. It's preliminary. So are heart attacks." Grant slammed the mute button violently. His assistant froze near the doorway, holding project folders. Grant rubbed both hands across his face aggressively. 3 days. Everything started collapsing within 3 days. 2 investors backed away from the Portsmouth Marina project. 1 contractor demanded immediate payment guarantees. And now compliance investigators were requesting expanded documentation. Grant hated documentation. Documentation created trails. His phone buzzed. "Savannah." He answered immediately. "What now?" She stood inside Harbor Ridge, staring at ocean waves crashing beneath the cliffs outside the windows. Her voice sounded tight. "Martin says investigators may contact me." Grant walked toward the office windows. "Then cooperate carefully." "What does that mean?" "It means don't volunteer things unnecessarily." Savannah closed her eyes briefly. "That sounds bad." Grant exhaled sharply. "You're panicking again, because nobody's explaining anything clearly." Grant lowered his voice. "Savannah, listen to me. These reviews happen constantly in development financing. Then why are investors pulling out silence? Small, but deadly." Savannah noticed immediately. "Grant, they're overreacting." No confidence this time, only pressure. That frightened her more than yelling would have. Meanwhile, inside the compliance office, Chad continued explaining transaction sequences with calm precision. One investigator pointed toward the $94,000 transfer. Your wife initiated this movement independently. Yes. Did you authorize it? No. Did she have legal access? Yes. Important distinction. Legal access, not legal intent. Denise leaned forward slightly. Mr. Flores, are you attempting criminal action against your wife? That question mattered. Rebecca watched Chad carefully before he answered. No. Denise paused. Why not Chad looked down briefly at the transfer logs? Because poor judgment and criminal intent are not automatically the same thing. Rebecca's eyes shifted toward him quietly after that. Most people under betrayal pressure became vindictive once systems started validating them. Chad still sounded measured. That increased his credibility enormously. Denise nodded once. Understood. The interview continued another 2 hours. By the end, investigators possessed complete timelines, account classifications, disclosure records, and transfer chains connected to Whitmore development entities. Nothing emotional, only structure. That was the dangerous thing about Chad Flores. He understood that systems trusted consistency more than performance. Outside the building afterward, freezing wind rolled through downtown Portland while Rebecca and Chad stood near the sidewalk. Rebecca adjusted her gloves. Well, she said quietly, you just became the most credible person in this entire mess. Chad looked toward the harbor. I didn't want credibility. No, Rebecca replied. You wanted accuracy. Traffic hissed through wet streets nearby. Rebecca lowered her voice. Grant Whitmore's lawyers are already requesting delays. That was fast. That means they're scared. Chad remained silent, because fear changed behavior quickly, and scared people usually made mistakes. That evening, Savannah drove toward Grant's waterfront condo for dinner. Snow lined the streets in dirty gray piles, while Christmas lights reflected across wet pavement downtown. Grant opened the door holding whiskey. He looked exhausted, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. That alone unsettled Savannah. Grant Whitmore never looked exhausted publicly. What happened? She asked immediately. Nothing. Don't do that. Do it pretend. Grant walked toward the kitchen without answering. Savannah followed. Stacks of paperwork covered the marble island. Loan summaries, project estimates, legal notices. One envelope carried a federal compliance header. Savannah stopped walking. Oh my God. Grant poured whiskey aggressively. It's manageable. You said there was no investigation. I said preliminary review. That's the same thing. No, Grant snapped suddenly. It's not. The room fell silent. Savannah stared at him. This was the first time she had seen real cracks underneath his polished image. Grant noticed her expression immediately and softened his tone. Look, these people dig around every large development eventually. Did you do something illegal? Grant laughed once, short, humorless. Savannah, if you built anything significant in this country without bending rules occasionally, you'd never finish a single project. That answer chilled her, because it wasn't denial. She looked around the condo slowly. Designer furniture, harbor views, imported stone counters. Everything suddenly felt less stable, less permanent. What happens if the review gets worse? She asked quietly. Grant took a long drink. It won't. But now he sounded like a man trying to convince himself. Later that night, Chad returned briefly to Harbor Ridge to collect additional files, while Savannah remained downtown with Grant. The house stood silent above the ocean cliffs. Dark. Cold. He unlocked the front door carefully. Inside, traces of Savannah remained everywhere. Perfume near the staircase, wine glasses beside the sink, designer coats hanging near the entry. But something else lingered now, too. Absence. Chad walked downstairs toward his office. Several drawers had been searched. Folders slightly misaligned, cabinet locks scratched lightly. Savannah had gone hunting for more money. He wasn't surprised. He opened one cabinet, and removed another encrypted drive hidden behind old insurance binders. Then he stopped. One folder sat partially open on the desk. Whitmore transfer authorizations. Chad stared at it for several seconds. Savannah must have opened it, maybe recently, maybe tonight, which meant she finally understood how directly connected she had become. Outside, Atlantic waves crashed violently against the rocks below Harbor Ridge. Inside the office, Chad closed the folder carefully and slipped the drive into his coat pocket. Then his phone buzzed. Rebecca. He answered immediately. "You need to hear this now," she said. Her voice sounded tighter than usual. Grant Whitmore's financial records were formally subpoenaed an hour ago. Chad looked slowly around the empty office, and Savannah Rebecca paused. She's officially attached to the review chain. The Grand Harbor Hotel Christmas Gala happened every December along Portland's waterfront. Politicians came for visibility. Developers came for investors. Realtors came for photographs. And people like Savannah Flores came because events like this helped maintain the illusion that success was permanent. By 7 o'clock, Friday night, the ballroom glowed gold beneath enormous chandeliers, while jazz drifted softly across polished marble floors. Waiters carried trays of champagne between wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. Outside, snow covered the harbor sidewalks in white silence. Inside, everyone performed confidence. Savannah stood near the center of the ballroom wearing a dark emerald dress Grant once called dangerously expensive looking. Her makeup was flawless, hair perfect, diamond bracelet catching light each time she lifted a champagne glass. From a distance, she still looked like a woman winning. That mattered deeply to her, especially now. 3 guests approached her near the ballroom entrance. Savannah 1. Woman smiled brightly. "We heard things are finally official with Chad." Savannah forced a polished laugh, "Almost. And the house we're working through details." The woman leaned closer conspiratorially. "You deserve better than that boring accountant." More laughter. Savannah smiled automatically, but the words landed differently tonight. Boring accountant. That phrase used to comfort her. Now it sounded dangerously incomplete. Across the ballroom, Grant Whitmore entertained 2 investors beside the bar. Navy tuxedo, white pocket square, controlled smile. He still looked impressive publicly, but Chad Flores would have noticed the details immediately. The slightly loosened posture, the extra whiskey, the constant checking of his phone. Pressure leaked through successful men in microscopic ways first. Grant saw Savannah watching him and raised his glass confidently. Performance. Always performance. At 7:42 p.m., Savannah's phone buzzed with another message from Martin Keller. "Do not sign anything else for Whitmore." She locked the screen immediately. Didn't answer. Didn't show Grant. Because deep down, Savannah still wanted reality to reverse itself somehow. She wanted Chad to become weak again. She wanted Grant to become stable again. She wanted the world simple again. Instead, everything kept becoming more complicated. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Chad Flores sat alone inside his apartment, wearing a dark charcoal suit and adjusting his tie slowly in the bathroom mirror. He almost didn't attend the gala. Then Rebecca Sloan called earlier that afternoon. "You should go." Why? Because visible calm unsettles guilty people. That sounded like Rebecca. Cold, practical, usually correct. Chad disliked social events even before the marriage collapsed. Wealth performance exhausted him. Too many conversations built entirely around signaling status. Still, he drove downtown just after 8. The old Ford pickup looked almost absurd beside luxury sedans lining the hotel entrance. Valets noticed immediately. People always noticed visible modesty around wealth. The ballroom noise softened slightly when Chad entered. Not dramatically, just enough. Several guests recognized him immediately. Conversation shifted. Eyes followed. because public divorces functioned like entertainment among affluent circles, especially when people believed they already knew the villain and victim. Savannah saw Chad near the entrance and froze momentarily, not because he looked angry, because he didn't. No visible resentment, no humiliation. He simply looked composed. That frightened her more than confrontation would have. Grant approached first, smiling broadly. "Chad," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "didn't expect to see you here." Chad shook his hand once. "Neither did I." Grant laughed, still performing. "Well, glad you made it." Chad nodded politely. Nothing more. No tension, no accusations, just control. And that control began unsettling people almost immediately. Savannah approached, carefully holding champagne. "You look nice," she said softly. True statement. Chad cleaned up well when he bothered trying. Dark suit tailored properly, calm posture, quiet confidence. He thanked her politely, then silence formed between them. Heavy silence. Not marital silence, aftermath silence. Nearby guests pretended not to observe while absolutely observing. Grant stepped in smoothly. "We were just talking about Portsmouth expansion plans." Chad looked toward him. "How's financing?" Tiny question. Tiny change, massive effect. Grant smiled again. "Temporary delays?" That sound alone irritated Grant visibly, because Chad said it like someone already knew more. One investor nearby glanced between them carefully. Another checked his phone. Pressure traveled socially faster than facts. Savannah noticed that too. At 8:17 p.m., the gala orchestra began playing near the ballroom stage, while hotel staff opened additional champagne stations. Grant disappeared briefly toward the lobby for a business call. Savannah watched him leave, then looked back toward Chad, standing quietly near the harbor windows. Snow drifted outside behind him. For the first time in years, she noticed how still he always was. Not passive, anchored. There was a difference. She walked toward him slowly. "You didn't have to come tonight, I know. Then why did you?" Chad looked toward the frozen harbor outside. Rebecca thought it was useful. Savannah almost smiled despite herself. That sounds like her. Silence again. Then Savannah lowered her voice. "Are things really that bad for Grant?" Chad answered honestly. "I don't know yet." "But you suspect?" "Yes." She stared down into her champagne glass. "I thought I understood successful people." Chad looked at her carefully after that. "You understand visible success." That sentence hurt because it was precise. Savannah looked away immediately. Across the ballroom, whispers began spreading near the investor tables. Phones appeared. Messages exchanged quietly. One man suddenly left the bar area entirely, then another. Grant Whitmore re-entered the ballroom at 8:31, and immediately something looked wrong. His face had lost color, not dramatically, just enough. He walked faster than usual toward the investors near the back corner. Too fast. One investor shook his head before Grant even reached him. Another folded paperwork into a jacket pocket. Grant spoke quietly but aggressively. People noticed. Successful men weren't supposed to look desperate publicly. Savannah started toward him, then stopped halfway, because at that exact moment 2 men in dark overcoats entered through the hotel lobby doors. Not flashy, not dramatic, no badges displayed openly, but calm in a very specific way. The kind of calm that came from authority. Chad noticed them immediately. Of course he did. One of the men spoke quietly with hotel management near the entrance desk. Grant saw them 2 seconds later. Everything changed in his face. Fear arrived instantly. Pure, uncontrolled. Savannah had never seen that expression on him before. Not once. Grant grabbed his phone immediately. Dialed someone. No answer. He looked around the ballroom rapidly. Exit calculations. Chad recognized the behavior at once. Cornered financial actors always began searching for movement paths first. One of the overcoat men started walking toward Grant calmly, not rushing. No need. Savannah's pulse accelerated. "What's happening?" she whispered. Chad didn't answer immediately, because now certainty existed, and certainty made silence heavier. Grant reached Savannah quickly. "We need to go." "Why now?" "What happened, Savannah?" Sharp tone. Real panic now. People nearby noticed instantly. The music still played. Champagne still flowed. But the atmosphere changed beneath it, like pressure dropping before a storm. The overcoat men stopped several feet away. One spoke quietly. Mr. Whitmore Grant forced composure violently back onto his face. "Yes, we need a few minutes of your time regarding ongoing financial review procedures." Nearby conversations died almost completely. Savannah felt blood drain from her face. Grant smiled weakly. "Can this wait until Monday?" Number's simple answer. Deadly answer. The second investigator looked toward Savannah briefly, not accusing, just recognizing. That was worse somehow. Grant's jaw tightened. "Am I being charged with something?" "Not tonight." "Not tonight." Again, terrible wording. Savannah suddenly realized half the ballroom was watching now while pretending not to. Public humiliation. The thing she feared most. Grant looked toward Chad instinctively. Huge mistake, because now everyone else looked too. And Chad Flores stood calmly beside the harbor windows, with one hand in his pocket and snow falling silently behind him. Not triumphant, not emotional, just prepared. The first investigator gestured politely toward the lobby. Mr. Whitmore Grant swallowed visibly, then walked with them toward the hotel entrance, while whispers exploded softly behind him across the ballroom. Savannah remained frozen in place, champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand, and for the first time since leaving Chad, she finally understood something terrifying. The quiet man everyone dismissed had never been behind the situation. He had been ahead of it the entire time. By Monday morning, 3 of Grant Whitmore's accounts were frozen. Not permanently, not publicly, but enough. Enough to terrify lenders. Enough to trigger whispers across Portland development circles. Enough to start unraveling the image he spent 15 years constructing. Financial collapses rarely happened all at once. They happened in layers. First confidence disappeared, then liquidity, then loyalty. At 6:40 a.m., Chad Flores sat alone inside Rosie's diner near India Street, eating scrambled eggs while snow drifted outside the windows in slow gray waves. The waitress poured more coffee into his mug. "You look less tired lately," she said casually. Chad almost smiled. "Maybe I'm sleeping better." That was partially true. Once uncertainty became evidence, Chad's mind settled more easily. Across the diner, dock workers discussed weather forecasts and Patriots football. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always did. Meanwhile, Savannah Flores woke inside Harbor Ridge to 17 missed calls. Grant, Martin Keller, unknown numbers, 2 lenders she didn't recognize. Her phone buzzed again immediately the moment she unlocked it. Grant calling. She answered. What Grant's voice sounded completely different now. No charm, no smoothness, only pressure. "Did anyone contact you directly?" Savannah sat upright instantly. "Who investigators?" "No." "Good." The word hit hard again. Good. Always operational with him now, never emotional. Savannah rubbed her forehead. "What's happening?" "Nothing if people stay calm. Grant accounts are getting frozen. Temporary review holds." "That's not what Martin said." Grant exhaled sharply. "Stop repeating what lawyers say." Savannah stood and walked toward the bedroom windows overlooking the ocean cliffs. Winter waves crashed violently below Harbor Ridge. For years, the sound comforted her. Today it sounded lonely. "You lied to me," she said quietly. "No, you told me Chad was weak." Grant stayed silent for 1 second too long. "That's not the same thing." "Yes," Savannah whispered. "It is." Grant lowered his voice. "Listen carefully. If investigators contact you, keep answers narrow. Don't speculate. Don't volunteer unnecessary details. Again, operational language, protective language, not relationship language. Savannah suddenly realized something awful. Grant never actually talked about a future anymore. Only damage control. Meanwhile, Chad arrived at Rebecca Sloan's office carrying updated transaction records. Rebecca already stood beside the conference table reviewing new filings. "Morning," she said. "You sound busy." "I am busy." Rebecca handed him another printed report. Additional Whitmore entities under review. Expanded subpoena scope. Secondary contractor interviews. The investigation was widening exactly how Chad predicted. He scanned the pages quietly. What about Savannah? Rebecca removed her glasses slowly. She's still considered peripheral. For now. Yes. That phrase lingered heavily. Rebecca studied Chad carefully. "You understand most people would feel vindicated at this stage." "I understand. But you don't." "No." Rebecca nodded once. Because Chad's emotional restraint no longer surprised her. What surprised her was the consistency of it. Most people eventually cracked under betrayal. Either rage or grief took over. Chad remained disciplined. Not emotionless. Discipline. There was a difference. Rebecca sat down across from him. "We need to prepare for court." Chad nodded. "The documentation package is already complete. That's not what worries me." What as Rebecca folded her hands? "Savannah's credibility is collapsing faster than expected." Chad looked toward the office windows. Snow-covered Federal Street below in dirty white slush. She did that herself. "Yes," Rebecca said quietly. "But I think she's only beginning to realize it." At 11:20 a.m., Savannah entered Whitmore Development's downtown office and immediately sensed something wrong. Too quiet. Assistants avoided eye contact. Phones rang unanswered longer than normal. One conference room sat empty except for half-packed document boxes. Grant emerged from his office carrying files. He looked exhausted. Why are people packing administrative restructuring? Savannah stared at him. "You really expect me to believe that Grant set the files down hard? What exactly do you want from me right now?" "The truth." "The truth is that this happens in business." "No," Savannah said. "This happens when people are hiding things." Grant stepped closer immediately. "Careful." That tone changed everything. Savannah took a step backward instinctively. For the first time since meeting him, Grant Whitmore looked dangerous instead of impressive. Not physically, structurally. Like a man realizing the walls around him were shrinking. He softened his voice quickly after noticing her reaction. "I'm under pressure. You used me. That's ridiculous. You needed money. I needed temporary liquidity. You told me Chad hid wealth." Grant laughed once. "He did hide wealth." "No," Savannah replied quietly. "He protected it." Silence. Grant looked away first. Again. Savannah finally understood what Chad noticed months ago. Confidence and control were not the same thing. Grant depended on movement, momentum, applause. Chad depended on systems. Systems survived panic better. At 2:15 p.m., Chad returned briefly to Harbor Ridge to collect winter clothing and additional records. The house felt colder every visit now, not physically, emotionally. He walked through the kitchen slowly. Savannah's unopened mail covered part of the counter. Legal notices, bank correspondence, 2 overnight envelopes from Martin Keller, 1 from Northeast Financial Compliance. The ocean beyond the windows looked iron gray beneath heavy clouds. Chad moved downstairs toward his office, then stopped. Several shelves were empty now. Savannah had removed folders, searching again, searching emotionally. That usually meant fear was accelerating. He opened the desk drawer carefully. Inside sat the leather-bound notebook he thought he already packed weeks earlier. Chad picked it up slowly. Savannah must have missed it during her searches. Inside were 15 years of handwritten notes, routine observations, financial reminders, occasional personal entries. He flipped carefully through pages dated across their marriage, vacation budgets, roof repair costs, mortgage calculations. Then one entry stopped him completely. October 14th. Savannah laughed when I asked her to review trust documents. Said she trusts me completely. Chad stared at the sentence quietly. Trust? Funny word now. Not because it disappeared suddenly, because it disappeared gradually while both people pretended not to notice. Upstairs, the front door opened unexpectedly. Savannah. She froze the moment she saw Chad standing in the hallway holding the notebook. For several seconds, neither moved. Snow blew lightly outside behind her. You still have keys, she said softly. Yes. You could have told me you were coming. I used to live here. The sentence wasn't cruel. That made it worse. Savannah removed her gloves slowly. You look different. Chad almost smiled slightly. So do you. True statement. Savannah looked exhausted now, less polished, less certain. She noticed the notebook in his hand. What is that? Nothing important. Can I ask you something? You usually do. A flicker of old irritation crossed her face, then disappeared. What happens if they connect me directly to Grant's finances? Chad answered honestly. That depends how connected you are. And if I didn't understand everything, he looked at her carefully. Courts care more about signatures than intentions sometimes. Savannah closed her eyes briefly because she finally understood the real danger. Not theft, documentation, every transfer, every authorization, every ignored disclosure, all preserved, all traceable. She looked around Harbor Ridge slowly. The house no longer felt luxurious. It felt temporary. What if I made a mistake, she whispered. Chad remained silent for several seconds. Then finally, you made several. That honesty hurt her more than anger would have. Outside waves slammed against the cliffs below the property. Inside, the distance between them felt enormous now. Not because of screaming, because of accumulated truth. Chad walked toward the front door, carrying the notebook and one storage box. Before leaving, he paused once beside Savannah. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I never wanted this outcome. Then he left Harbor Ridge again, while snow drifted across the driveway behind him. Savannah stood alone inside the silent house listening to the ocean, and for the first time since the affair began, she finally understood something terrifying. Chad Flores was never fighting emotionally. He was simply allowing reality enough time to expose everyone honestly. The Cumberland County Courthouse smelled faintly of old paper floor polish and wet winter coats. By 8:15 a.m. snow covered the courthouse steps in compressed gray slush, while attorneys hurried through metal detectors, carrying leather briefcases and overstuffed legal folders. Inside, Courtroom 4B, Chad Flores sat beside Rebecca Sloan, wearing the same calm expression he carried into every room lately. No performance, no visible anger, just stillness. That stillness changed the atmosphere around him now. People no longer interpreted it as weakness. They interpreted it carefully. Across the aisle, Savannah Flores sat beside Martin Keller near the plaintiff's table. She looked thinner than she had 2 months earlier. Dark circles beneath her eyes softened the polished image she once maintained effortlessly. Grant Whitmore was not present. That absence spoke loudly by itself. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered at precisely 8:58, efficient woman mid-60s, reputation for low tolerance toward emotional theatrics in financial cases. Good. Rebecca preferred judges who valued structure over sympathy. The hearing began with procedural review, property classification, asset tracing, disclosure acknowledgement. Nothing dramatic initially. That was the dangerous thing about courtroom destruction. It usually sounded boring. Martin Keller opened carefully. My client acknowledges procedural mistakes during emotional distress surrounding marital breakdown. Interesting phrasing. Rebecca wrote something down immediately. Martin continued. However, Mrs. Flores acted under the reasonable belief that marital assets were being concealed through unnecessarily complex financial structures. Judge Whitaker adjusted her glasses slightly. Concealed or documented? Small question. Sharp question. Martin hesitated half a second. Documented in technically compliant ways difficult for non-specialists to interpret. Rebecca stood smoothly. Your Honor, may I respond? You may. Rebecca approached the evidence monitor calmly. No dramatic pacing, no raised voice. She displayed the first document, Annual Financial Disclosure Summary, signed Savannah Flores, then another, Protected Asset Classification Acknowledgement, signed Savannah Flores, then another, Operational Account Designation Review, signed Savannah Flores. Year after year after year. Rebecca spoke quietly while the documents appeared on screen. These were not hidden structures. These were disclosed structures repeatedly acknowledged over nearly a decade. Judge Whitaker reviewed the signatures carefully. Martin shifted slightly beside Savannah. Rebecca continued. Mrs. Flores had access to every classification, every trust designation, every operational summary, and every advisory recommendation connected to these accounts. Savannah stared at the screen silently. She remembered almost none of them. That was the problem. Rebecca turned toward the judge. Complexity is not concealment simply because someone chooses not to pay attention. That line landed hard inside the courtroom because it sounded undeniable. Martin rose again quickly. Your Honor, intent matters here. Rebecca nodded immediately. I agree. Then she displayed the transfer chronology. Color-coded timelines appeared across the monitor. Transfer dates, authorization locations, routing patterns, Whitmore-linked entities. Everything aligned visually with brutal clarity. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Judge Whitaker leaned slightly forward. These transfers were initiated over multiple days. Yes, Your Honor, Rebecca replied, structured incrementally to avoid triggering institutional scrutiny. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Hearing it described that way sounded terrible, because now the pattern looked intentional, calculated. Judge Whitaker looked toward Savannah. Mrs. Flores, were you aware funds transferred into Whitmore-connected entities were under review? Martin answered immediately. My client was not aware of any formal review process. Rebecca spoke again. Which is supported by evidence, Your Honor. That surprised everyone slightly, even Martin. Rebecca continued calmly. We are not alleging Mrs. Flores knowingly participated in financial fraud. Savannah looked toward Chad instinctively after hearing that. He remained motionless beside Rebecca. No satisfaction, no cruelty, only observation. Judge Whitaker folded her hands. Then, what exactly are you alleging? Rebecca answered simply. Recklessness. That word settled heavily across the courtroom, because recklessness carried consequences even without criminal intent. Rebecca called Chad to testify shortly afterward. He walked to the witness stand, calmly placed one hand on the Bible, and swore in with the same quiet tone he used ordering coffee. No drama, no trembling. That credibility mattered immediately. Rebecca approached first. Mr. Flores, did you ever hide assets from your wife? No. Did Mrs. Flores have access to financial disclosures? Yes. Did she sign acknowledgement forms? Yes. Rebecca displayed another document on screen. Did you create shell accounts? Yes. Murmurs moved softly through the courtroom. Martin looked up sharply. Judge Whitaker narrowed her eyes slightly. Rebecca remained calm. Please explain. Chad folded his hands loosely. Operational shell accounts are legal accounting structures commonly used for liability separation, transaction isolation, and audit transparency. Were these accounts illegal? No. Were they disclosed? Yes. Did you place all marital assets inside them? No. Rebecca nodded once. Why create them? Chad answered without hesitation. Because vulnerable systems require traceability. That sentence lingered. Rebecca stepped slightly closer. Did you anticipate your wife would drain them? Long pause. Not for performance, for accuracy. I anticipated vulnerability, Chad said quietly. Rebecca let the silence sit, then asked the question everyone waited for. Did you want your wife investigated? No. Then why allow the transfers? Chad looked briefly toward Savannah before answering. Because stopping people too early prevents them from revealing intent clearly. Even Judge Whitaker studied him differently after that answer. Not emotionally, professionally. Martin approached for cross-examination carefully. You prepared these structures years in advance. Yes. You expected your wife to betray you? No. Then why prepare? Chad answered immediately. Because systems should survive worst-case scenarios. Martin paced once slowly. You sound emotionally detached from your marriage. Interesting tactic. Chad recognized it instantly. I'm not detached. Really? Yes. Martin folded his arms. Then describe how you felt watching your wife transfer money and leave you. Silence settled heavily across the courtroom. Rebecca objected softly. Relevance. Judge Whitaker considered briefly. Overruled. He may answer. Everyone watched Chad now, including Savannah. Especially Savannah, because she suddenly realized she had no idea what he would say. Chad looked down briefly at the witness stand before answering, like someone watching a bridge collapse in slow motion after years of maintenance warnings. The courtroom stayed completely silent afterward, not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded honest. Martin stopped pacing. That answer destroyed the image he wanted to create. No bitterness, no vengeance, only disappointment and preparation. Martin shifted strategy quickly. You still benefited from allowing these transfers to continue? No. Your wife exposed herself while you remained protected. Chad's eyes stayed steady. I documented behavior. I didn't create it. That line ended the cross-examination emotionally, whether Martin realized it or not, because now the courtroom understood the difference between manipulation and observation. Later that afternoon, Rebecca presented the final ledger summaries, protected inheritance structures, operational account balances, actual accessible marital liquidity. The numbers shocked Savannah again. The accounts she drained represented only a fraction of Chad's true financial architecture. Not because he hid money illegally, because he separated it intelligently long before the marriage collapsed. Judge Whitaker reviewed the final documents silently, then looked directly toward Savannah. Mrs. Flores, do you dispute these signatures? And no. Do you dispute authorizing the transfers? No. Do you dispute receiving disclosure summaries? Savannah swallowed carefully. No. The judge nodded once. That was enough. By 4:37 p.m., the hearing ended pending final ruling review overnight. People slowly gathered papers and stood from their seats. Savannah remained seated longer than everyone else. Exhausted, deflated. Martin leaned down quietly beside her. We minimized damage where we could. Not victory language anymore. Damage language. Across the courtroom, Chad packed his folders neatly into one document case, while Rebecca spoke softly beside him. You did well? Chad looked toward the emptying courtroom. This doesn't feel like winning. Rebecca followed his gaze toward Savannah. No, she said quietly. It usually doesn't. As Chad turned toward the exit, Savannah finally looked directly at him again. Not at the quiet husband, not at the boring accountant, at the man who saw the collapse coming long before anyone else did. and now sitting alone beneath fluorescent courtroom lights while lawyers packed evidence around her. Savannah Flores finally understood the full weight of the mistake she made. She never lost to revenge, she lost to preparation. Snow fell quietly across Portland. The morning Judge Whitaker issued the final rulings. No cameras waited outside the courthouse. No reporters crowded the steps. Most real endings happened without applause. At 9:12 a.m., Chad Flores sat beside Rebecca Sloan in courtroom 4B while the judge reviewed the finalized orders through reading glasses balanced low on her nose. Savannah sat across the aisle wearing a dark wool coat and almost no makeup. She looked exhausted now in ways expensive clothing could no longer hide. Grant Whitmore still hadn't appeared publicly in over a week. Rumors moved faster than facts across Maine business circles. Federal review, frozen financing, investor withdrawal, potential civil exposure. Nobody knew the full truth yet, but they knew enough to stay away. Judge Whitaker spoke clearly. The court recognizes the documented distinction between protected inheritance, property, operational business entities, and marital assets. Paper shuffled softly across the courtroom. The Harbor Ridge residence remains protected under the pre-existing inheritance trust structure, established prior to marital dispute. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Not dramatic, just tired. The judge continued. Mrs. Flores retains responsibility for unauthorized financial transfers executed independently beyond reasonable marital allocation expectations. Another sentence followed, then another. Civil reimbursement conditions, financial restrictions, further review contingencies regarding Whitmore-connected transfers. Nothing theatrical, just consequences arranged carefully into legal language. Chad listened without visible reaction. That unsettled people more now than before, because calmness looked different once it proved accurate. Judge Whitaker finally looked directly toward both parties. This court finds no evidence Mr. Flores concealed assets unlawfully. Silence. Then, however, the court finds substantial evidence that documented disclosures were ignored repeatedly despite accessible review opportunities. That line landed hardest. Ignored, not tricked, not manipulated, ignored. The ruling ended at 9:46 a.m. People stood slowly. Folders closed. Chairs moved softly across courtroom floors. Savannah remained seated several seconds longer than everyone else. Martin Keller leaned down quietly beside her. You avoided the worst-case scenario. She almost laughed at that. Worst-case scenario. A month ago, worst-case scenario meant losing a luxury house. Now it meant federal investigators not charging her with anything. Perspective changed brutally fast. Across the courtroom, Rebecca Sloan packed documents into organized stacks while Chad buttoned his coat slowly. You're free now, Rebecca said quietly. Chad looked toward the courthouse windows where snow drifted across gray skies. No, he replied softly. Now I'm responsible for what happens next. Rebecca studied him carefully. Most people left court emotionally inflated after winning. Chad looked reflective instead. That probably explained why he won in the first place. Outside the courthouse, cold wind rolled through downtown Portland while attorneys disappeared toward parking garages and coffee shops. Savannah exited the building alone. No Grant, no social friends. No luxury circle supporters waiting with comforting smiles. People avoided financial collapse publicly the same way they avoided contagious illness. From across the street, Chad noticed her standing motionless near the courthouse steps, staring into the snow. For a brief moment, he considered walking away entirely. Then he crossed the street quietly. Savannah looked up when she heard footsteps approaching. You got everything, she said softly. Interesting sentence. Not accusation. Not bitterness. Just exhaustion. Chad stopped beside her beneath the falling snow. No, he said calmly. I kept what was already mine. She looked down at the sidewalk. That sounds worse somehow. Traffic hissed through wet streets nearby. Savannah folded her arms against the cold. Grant disappeared. Chad wasn't surprised. When 3 days ago, lawyers. He stopped answering everyone. That silence told Chad enough. Grant Whitmore survived through momentum and perception. Once those collapsed, he likely shifted into self-preservation mode immediately. People like Grant rarely stayed beside damaged assets. And Savannah finally understood she had become one. She looked toward Chad carefully. You knew he would run. I suspected. You knew almost everything. No, Chad said. I just recognized the pattern. Snow gathered lightly across Savannah's dark coat. For years, she believed Chad lacked charisma because he lacked noise. Now she realized silence gave him room to observe things other people missed. What happens to me now? She asked quietly. Chad answered honestly. That depends what investigators find. Fear moved across her face again. Real fear this time. Not social embarrassment, structural fear, the kind people felt when systems stopped bending around them. Savannah swallowed carefully. I never thought you were weak, she said suddenly. Chad looked at her. She corrected herself slowly. No, that's not true. I did. Honest sentence. Painfully honest. You were so quiet all the time. Chad glanced toward the harbor beyond downtown buildings. Quiet and weak aren't the same thing. Savannah nodded faintly. Now she understood that too late. Later that afternoon, Chad returned alone to Harbor Ridge. The house stood silent above the winter Atlantic, while pale sunlight reflected across frozen shoreline rocks below. He unlocked the front door slowly. Inside, emptiness echoed differently now. Savannah had already removed most of her belongings. Designer chairs gone, closet half empty, kitchen counter stripped clean except for one forgotten coffee mug beside the sink. The house looked larger without performance inside it. Chad walked room by room quietly, not reminiscing, observing. Scratches across hardwood floors near the dining room. Water stains beneath the upstairs window frame he kept meaning to repair. Nail holes where Savannah once hung oversized abstract paintings, tiny details of ordinary life. Funny how marriages eventually reduce themselves into maintenance memories. He entered the downstairs office last. The room remained mostly untouched except for open drawers and disturbed folders from Savannah's searches weeks earlier. Chad sat slowly behind the old desk. For the first time in months, complete silence surrounded him. No alerts, no legal calls, no transfer notifications, only ocean wind outside. He opened the leather notebook again, turned through old pages carefully, budget notes, repair estimates, random reminders. Then another entry caught his attention. March 3rd. Savannah said the house feels safe during storms. Chad stared at the sentence longer than expected, because despite everything, some parts of the marriage had once been real. That was the hardest truth underneath betrayal. People rarely fake everything. His phone buzzed softly. Rebecca. You all right? She asked immediately. Yes, you sound tired. I am. A pause. Then Rebecca asked carefully, What are you thinking about, Chad? Looked around the empty office. That I spent years protecting structures while the relationship itself collapsed quietly. Rebecca remained silent because there wasn't really a response for that. Finally, she said, What will you do with the house? Chad looked toward the ocean outside the office windows. Sell it. You sure? Yes. Why? He answered simply. Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life living inside a completed argument. Rebecca almost laughed softly at that. Fair enough. After the call ended, Chad walked upstairs carrying one final storage box. Before leaving, he stopped near the large living room windows overlooking the Atlantic. Winter waves crashed against the cliffs below Harbor Ridge with cold rhythmic force. The house still looked beautiful, still valuable, still impressive. But Chad finally understood something clearly. Peace and status were not the same thing. Savannah spent years choosing status. Grant built an empire entirely around status. Both collapsed the moment pressure arrived. Chad looked once more across the empty living room. Then he turned off the lights and walked out of Harbor Ridge for the final time. Outside, snow continued falling softly over the coastline, while the ocean erased footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. And somewhere behind him inside the house, Savannah once believed guaranteed victory. Only silence remained. 6 months later, Chad Flores stood on the front porch of a small cedar cabin overlooking Penobscot Bay with a cup of black coffee warming his hands. Sunrise spread slowly across the Atlantic in pale silver light, while fishing boats drifted through morning fog below the cliffs. No traffic, no gala invitations, no marble kitchens, just ocean wind and quiet. The cabin sat outside Camden, Maine, on 3 acres of rocky coastline, surrounded by pine trees and salt air. Small place. 1 story. Weathered wood siding, old stone fireplace, exactly the kind of place Savannah once would have called depressing. Chad loved it immediately. His old Ford pickup sat parked beside the gravel driveway, still rusting slowly near the wheel wells. Rebecca Sloan joked 3 separate times that he could finally afford a better vehicle now. Chad ignored her every time. Some objects survived because they remained honest. The Harbor Ridge house sold in March. Quick sale. Quiet transaction. A retired surgeon from Connecticut bought it for cash after 1 viewing. Chad never visited the property again afterward. He didn't need to. Some chapters ended more cleanly if you stopped rereading them. By spring, Chad reopened his consulting work under a new firm name, Flores Financial Integrity Group. Small office near the Camden Harbor. 3 employees, mostly fraud tracing marital asset reviews and financial reconstruction cases for small businesses and attorneys. Nothing flashy, but steady. Very steady. Turns out there was enormous demand for people who actually understood how hidden money moved, especially after betrayal. One Thursday afternoon, Chad reviewed client files while rain tapped softly against the office windows overlooking the harbor. His assistant knocked lightly on the door. "There's someone asking for you." Who, she didn't say. Chad looked up, then froze slightly. Savannah stood near the reception area wearing a dark coat and holding a folder against her chest. She looked older. Not physically old, just worn by pressure. The sharp confidence she once carried everywhere had faded into caution. Chad stood slowly. His assistant glanced awkwardly between them. "It's fine," Chad said gently. The assistant disappeared toward the front desk. Savannah looked around the office quietly. Simple furniture, clean shelves, large windows facing the water. No luxury branding, no performative success. Everything looked practical. Very Chad. "You moved," she said softly. "Yes. It's beautiful here." Chad nodded once. "Can I help you with something?" Direct question? Not cold, just clear. Savannah held the folder tighter. "I got another notice." "From investigators, yes." Chad motioned toward the chair across from his desk. She sat carefully. For several seconds, neither spoke. Outside, rain moved across the harbor in silver waves. Finally, Savannah opened the folder. Additional financial review requests, document clarification demands, entity tracing confirmations. Chad scanned the pages quietly. "They're narrowing timelines," he said. Savannah rubbed her hands together nervously. "I cooperated. I know. They still think I knew more than I did." Chad looked at her carefully. "That's because signatures matter." Pain crossed her face immediately. Not anger anymore. Regret. Real regret. I should have listened to you. Chad remained silent, because some truths became cruel if repeated too often. Savannah looked around the office again. You really built all this quietly. Yes, you always did everything quietly. That was usually more efficient. For the first time in months, Savannah almost smiled. Almost. Then the smile disappeared again. What happened to Grant? Chad leaned back slightly. Civil investigations expanded. Is he going to prison? I don't know. But you probably know more than me. Yes. She nodded faintly. That no longer surprised her. Nothing about Chad surprised her anymore except how badly she misunderstood him for so long. Outside fog rolled slowly across Penobscot Bay. Savannah looked toward the water. I thought success looked like Grant. Chad followed her gaze toward the harbor. A lot of people do. And you? I thought stability mattered more. Silence again. Not hostile silence. Just honest distance. Savannah lowered her eyes toward the paperwork. I lost almost everything. Chad answered gently. No. You lost the version of life you trusted. That sentence stayed between them quietly. Because it was true. Savannah didn't just lose money. She lost confidence in her own judgment. That wound cut deeper. She stood slowly after a few minutes. I won't bother you again. You're not bothering me. You should hate me. Chad looked toward the rain outside before answering. Hate takes energy. Savannah swallowed hard. For years she interpreted Chad's calmness as emotional emptiness. Now she understood it differently. He simply refused to waste himself unnecessarily. Before leaving, Savannah paused beside the office door. One last question. Chad waited. When did you know the marriage was over? Long pause. Not hesitation. Reflection. Probably when you stopped being curious about my life. Savannah looked down immediately because she knew exactly what he meant. There were years she stopped asking questions, stopped listening, stopped seeing him as a full person outside her own ambitions. And by the time she noticed the silence growing between them, Chad had already begun building systems to survive it. She nodded, faintly, then left quietly into the rain. Chad watched through the office windows as her car disappeared slowly down the harbor road. No triumph, no satisfaction, only closure. That evening, Chad drove back toward the Cedar cabin along the coastline while sunset spread orange light across the Atlantic. The truck heater still rattled. The radio still cut in and out occasionally. None of it bothered him. At the cabin, he carried groceries inside and stepped back onto the porch with another cup of coffee just as darkness settled over the bay. Waves crashed softly below the cliffs. Pine trees moved in cold wind behind the house. Peace sounded smaller than people imagined. Not applause, not victory speeches, just the absence of chaos. Chad thought briefly about Harbor Ridge, about Savannah, about Grant Whitmore disappearing beneath investigations and collapsing investor trust. Then he let the thoughts go. Because the story was never really about revenge. It was about structure, preparation, patience. People mistook quiet men for weak men because noise was easier to recognize than discipline. But Chad Flores understood something most people never learned until too late. The most dangerous person in a collapsing room is usually the calmest one. And as dawn prepared to return slowly over Penobscot Bay, Chad finally slept without keeping records beside the bed. For the first time in years, nothing needed tracking anymore. Some people think strength has to be loud. They think power looks like expensive suits, confident speeches, luxury homes, or the ability to dominate a room. But life has a way of exposing the difference between appearance and structure. Chad Flores never won because he shouted louder. He won because he stayed disciplined while everyone else acted emotionally. He understood that patience, preparation, and truth outlast performance almost every time. A lot of people watching this story probably know what it feels like to be underestimated. Maybe you or the quiet person in the relationship, the one nobody noticed until things fell apart? Maybe someone mistook your calmness for weakness, or maybe you learned the hard way that ignoring details can cost more than money. Real stability is often invisible until pressure arrives. So tell me honestly down in the comments, if you were in Chad's position, would you have stayed calm? Or would you have reacted emotionally the moment betrayal started? And if you've ever been underestimated before, I want to hear your story too. And subscribe before you leave, because tomorrow's story is about a father who spent 20 years building a company for his son, only to discover the son had secretly transferred ownership to someone else behind his back.